Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jason Maganoy. I am the group publisher at SJC Media. I'm also the publisher of Canadian Business Magazine. So today we're going to be talking about entrepreneurship. But first, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So for today's panel, we are going to be talking about entrepreneurship. We're going to be talking about how you raise capital as an entrepreneur. And we're also going to be talking about how it's not the same for everyone. BIPOC entrepreneurs, women who are in the entrepreneurship space, members of the LGBTQ community, they face very unique barriers in accessing the capital they need. And to discuss this, we have three incredible leaders on this panel today. And to start, I'd love each of you to introduce yourself. So let's start with Isabelle.
Thank you, Jason. I'm Isabelle Hudon, the president and CEO of BDC, BDC being the only bank in Canada exclusively dedicated to SMEs and entrepreneurs.
You want me to go next?
Yes.
Jason? Yep.
Yes.
Jay-Ann Gilfoy. I'm the president and CEO of Meridian Credit Union. We are Ontario's largest credit union here, and I'm really excited to be here. We are a full-service financial institution with a strategy around making sure that the money that we're offering is going in service of people, planet, and community. So I'm also happy to be here.
Welcome. And Stephen.
Hello, I'm Stephen Morse. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Métis Voyageur Development Fund, which is a Métis Capital Corp, an Indigenous financial institute that lends specifically to Métis, though the Indigenous financial institutions across Canada, of which there are 59, lend to all Indigenous peoples across Canada.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So my first question is for all of you, and whoever wants to jump in first can. And the question is really simple. What would you identify from your perspective as the top barrier facing entrepreneurs from diverse and underserved communities who are trying to access capital?
Can I go? Can I go first?
Yes.
You can go first, Isabelle. Yeah.
I would say, and I think that everyone will be surprised, or maybe some of you will get surprised with my answer. I think that the first barrier with segments of populations that you've just named, Jason, is trust. The lack of trust between more conventional financial institutions and those groups is a real barrier. The second challenge, or the second barrier, at least from our point of view, from the BDC perspective and from my own perspective, is a lack of understanding of who those groups are and what the cultural references are. Without understanding this, it's very difficult, on top of lack of trust, to for us to deploy the capital that we have available for all entrepreneurs in Canada. So it's not a real typical banker answer, but after more than 2 years into my role, I stand in front of you totally convinced with my two answers here.
And I would agree with Isabelle on the trust piece. And I would say that the constructs of banking are obviously a colonial construct, right? And so just by nature of the design of the system means that if you don't fit into a very square box around who you are and what you do and what your things like your credit history look like, I think many of the large financial institutions don't have the flexibility to really understand, as Isabelle said, have time, desire, or the system around them to understand how to help somebody who looks different, whose needs are different. And I think, we are certainly amongst alternative financial institution like credit unions who do think, I think, differently by nature. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts, Stephen?
Well, I think that those are both largely true. I think that fundamentally one of the issues for Indigenous entrepreneurs, and it was reflected in one of the original documents about this thing, is their socioeconomic conditions. When you look at Indigenous people in Canada, and this is all Indigenous groups, Métis, First Nations, and Inuit, you see lower levels of wealth, lower levels of income, lower levels of educational attainment. You see lower levels of housing ownership, and the housing ownership is in worse repair and of worse value. So where does that arise? Well, that arises in just the issues that Isabelle and Jay-Ann were talking about, the history between Canada and Indigenous people. But those things have very real effects. It means that an Indigenous entrepreneur, on the average, typically, is coming to entrepreneurship with lower equity. And as fundamentally banking's working on lending on a multiple of equity, that's going to limit the number of startups and their expansion. So that's a fundamental problem. And to understand what a solution to that is, means to look at that class of Indigenous entrepreneurs and to say, given that we understand these circumstances, how do we still ensure that capital flows to good ideas? And if you look at Indigenous levels of labor participation, and you look at Indigenous levels of self-employment within that participating labor group, you find that Indigenous people are self-employed at a much lower rate than non-Indigenous Canadians. And absent some belief that somehow Indigenous people don't aspire to self-employment and don't aspire to entrepreneurship, which would fly actually in the face of Métis history, which is a culture built on entrepreneurship, then it means that somehow the market for money for small and medium-sized enterprises doesn't clear properly. It fails in a fundamental way. Indigenous financial institutions, Métis Capital Corps, are part of how to address that. And I think there needs to be a great deal of thought on the regulated commercial financial institutions on how they address those issues as well.
Stephen, my follow-up question to you is, can you share examples of the Indigenous experience when accessing capital to start a business?
Yeah, well, quite often, as I said, we have a number of people who come forward for support. And when we start looking at their circumstances and their business ideas, quite often equity is a real stress for them, bringing sufficient equity into a business. I was just at a meeting with the National Indigenous leaders and ministers, and there was a great presentation from Jen Harper, who's a First Nations entrepreneur with Cheekbone Beauty. And when she started, she had $500. Now that's a very successful corporation employing a lot of people. And we have companies that we support in Ontario that now employ 100 people. They're Indigenous owned. But they all seem to share that when they started, it was really difficult to start because of the lack of equity that they're able to bring. And equity is often thought of as, you reach out to family and to friends. But because of that lower intergenerational wealth transfer in Indigenous people, that source of equity is lower, housing's lower, savings tends to be lower. And that becomes a fundamental issue is how do they develop their business, understanding that the lack of equity creates an initial impedance to that business startup. Part of that answer is working with their community, very much working with the Indigenous community. For the Métis in Ontario, that would be working with the Métis Voyageur Development Fund. And some of the solutions that we can bring are accepting much higher debt to equity ratios than would be typical in the commercial banking sector. We might be at 7-to-1, 8-to-1, which is really difficult with the cost structure and the business model of a regulated financial institution for it to match. So sometimes it's taking an initial step, working within the community and the supports that are specifically available, and then perhaps working later with the Meridian credit unions, the business development banks, and other institutions that are interested in and committed to the Indigenous sector.
So my follow-up question to that is, how can financial institutions build trust? We talked about trust at the beginning of the panel. How can they build trust with Indigenous entrepreneurs?
I think a large part of that is working with the community. One thing that's noticeable for us is that we don't advertise our corporation and our services. And the reason for that is word of mouth. The connections between our community means that we're already oversubscribed. People look to their community when they're looking for capital. They look to their community when they're looking for financing, and you need to be embedded in that community. Now, the Métis Voyageur Development Fund is by its nature. For other financial institutions, that might involve meeting with communities, ensuring that Indigenous banking units are staffed with Indigenous people who are tied into that community, attending Indigenous community events, Aboriginal chambers of commerce. There are many ways that you can start to build a profile, build some familiarity with the Indigenous community. So I think those are ways that you can start to build trust, is by being involved fundamentally.
Yeah, but you see, Jason, compared to Stephen and his organization, we don't have the privilege of word of mouth in those communities, and not only with the Indigenous communities, but also Black communities. And we're doing a little bit better with women, because a few years ago we decided that it's a space that we wanted to occupy, but the word of mouth for us is partnering with organizations such as the organization that Stephen is leading, but also other organizations. Without partnering with organizations well respected on the ground, it will be impossible to move the needle quick and fast enough, at least from a BDC perspective, to build the trust. We need the partners to, first of all, teach us and say, listen, guys, like, take a step back and refine your narrative and look at your different questions, and then digging into this, you find like very unconscious bias that you need to correct. First, recognize and then correct. That my answer is here. The word of mouth for us is a sport that needs to be played with team players, and those team players are organizations on the ground, well respected in those communities, that will help us build the trust first before winning any of their business.
And I would say for us, it's the same. It's the same, Jason. You know, we have a phrase here, you know, we want to build capacity and enable finance to flow with communities. So finding those communities. And then I think inside our organization, and I know Isabelle does this at BDC too, you know, we're on our own journey, right? And we're clear about how do we as an organization make sure that we have a workforce that's reflective of its community. So we've invested in Indigenous employees and Black employees and people with LGBTQ++, you know, so we're trying to make sure our organization looks like those communities that we're trying to serve. So we want to make sure our inside and our outside match, so that when we have to look at things like policies and processes, we aren't looking at them with the same lens of, you know, of the history of where we've come from, but we're looking at it with new insights.
Wow. So you've described some of the ways that you're removing barriers, but my question is for Isabelle. So tell us about the BDC Accelerator Program.
Well, we've decided almost 2 years ago that based on the strong foundations of BDC, that we were more than capable of doing better and more. But we became very specific on where we could do better and what we could do more. And we have decided to not wait until all those big ideas are perfect and well-rounded and understood by everyone. We have decided to take a more innovative way and to launch pilot projects. And out of a pilot project, you always win, meaning that winning here doesn't mean that you win clients and success looks like a financial success first and foremost. A pilot project, you always win because you always learn something. And one of our pilot is to deploy capital with partners and with financial institutions, because in our mandate, we need to respect the fact that we need to be complementary to financial institutions. So we are not there to compete and aggressively compete, but we are there to support entrepreneurs that are not getting the support they need from other financial institutions. And looking at our total addressable market from a BDC perspective, it's in the thousands of clients, and I'll be more specific, between 300 and 400,000 SMEs slash entrepreneurs in Canada that are not getting the financial support they need. So I've asked myself, and as a team, we asked ourselves, how can we quickly address this market? Organically, internally, by ourselves, we can deliver a portion, but not all. So we are now piloting with financial institutions, and I'm glad to say with Meridian, and Jay-Ann and her team were quick and fast to say, yes, let's try it. We are deploying capital with Meridian to help a greater number of entrepreneurs, and not necessarily us taking more risks, but taking different risks. So combine what Meridian is ready to take as risks and our willingness to take another portion of the risk, it will mean that we will be altogether deploying more capital to a greater number of entrepreneurs. So it's very soon. We've just launched the pilot, but I can tell you that I have a lot of expectations around those pilots. And I'm very glad and happy and proud that both Meridian and BDC accepted this partnership arrangement. And I'm very glad that Jay-Ann accepted this, because as Jay-Ann said, an organization is an organization, but without their people, organizations are nothing. And under Jay-Ann's vision and leadership, instead of looking at BDC and saying, oh my God, they're doing the same thing that we do. I don't know if it's female approach, I think slightly, but why don't we team up together to do greater and better? So that's one way, Jason, that we are piloting an approach to get our reach to another level.
Wow. And so my follow-up is for Jay-Ann.
Yeah.
So why did you say yes?
Yeah.
And how has it been going?
So we put together a new strategy we called Meridian for Good, and it's all about really doing three things. One, making sure that we're building financial confidence for our retail members and our business members, that we are allowing access to financial services for everybody, and part of being a cooperative means that one of our values and principles is that anybody can be a member. So in order, by design, as a cooperative, we already believe in an equitable future. And then from a business perspective, as Isabelle just said, we know there's so much of the Canadian population, the growth in the Canadian population is going to come from Indigenous communities here in Canada, but also from people outside of the country. We already have a number of entrepreneurs in our organization who rely on our financing, and many of them share the same story, that when they found us, they've found a successful situation where they could start their businesses, and they worked you know, they weren't given that in other financial institutions. So it's in our DNA, it's in our strategy. We really believe it. And so we were so happy when BDC came and said they were thinking about this. We jumped on it. I think and the team is like so excited to do it. And how we're doing it is by reaching out to a number of associations. So associations in the Black community, in the Indigenous communities, in the women-led communities, and saying, you know, chambers of commerce, organizations that are trying to help their communities, like Stephen, you know, be successful when that wasn't their history. And so we've already got our first loan approved. So we're really excited about that. So we got great response, and we're already on the path.
So I have a follow-up. I want to do it. Like, I want to do it. How do I do it? And how do you assess? Like, what's the assessment criteria for this?
There's no different criterias than criterias that we apply to other clients, but teaming up with Meridian, they know better in Ontario who would need financial support than not that they know better, but they know in a different way. We also made sure that this pilot project is not only for underserved clientele, but we have a goal that into that pilot project, at least 50% of the client we will serve will be from one of the segments that was mentioned. So we want to stay as inclusive as possible, but we have a specific target that through this pilot project, we want to know if this approach, by combining different risks that we're ready to take, both Meridian and BDC, we're getting better at serving those segments of clients that traditionally are not getting as successful as other segments of the population with getting capital from us or from Meridian.
Wow. So that takes me to my next question for Stephen, which is, you touched upon it about Jen. You know, Jen started with $500. So the question is, I'm an aspiring entrepreneur. I'm an aspiring Indigenous entrepreneur. I don't have the capital to start. So how do I start? How do you recommend they begin their entrepreneurial journey?
I think that the first place they would look, and it's the natural place to look, would be within their community, at those organizations that are part of their community and embedded in their community. And that's going to be quite often Indigenous financial institutions like the Métis Voyageur Development Fund. In Northwest Ontario, it might be Anishinaabe Development Fund, but these are community-owned and embedded in their community. And because of the history between Indigenous people and between Canada, there are specific financial tools that are going to be available to Indigenous entrepreneurs, and those are going to be delivered on the whole through Indigenous community bodies such as the Métis Voyageur Development Fund. So when you're faced with that sort of, I've got limited capital, but I've got an idea, there are often community economic development officers you can work with to, you know, we were talking about what goes into an accelerator program, what might you need, and that the criteria may not be different, it's just the embedding of them. One of the difficulties quite often that we face with the really small entrepreneurs is that the equity is so limited that when we ask for a business plan, maybe they're purchasing a smaller business, they might need a certified business valuation, you might need an environmental assessment if there's property involved. Those sort of costs eat into your equity fairly rapidly. And as what you can borrow is a multiple of your equity, it has a real impact on your financing. So if you're approaching an Indigenous financial institution, typically you're going to find support for 75 to 100% of those costs. So that we might be, as part of our mandate, underwriting the cost of a business plan, of a CB, certified business valuation, of an environmental assessment, to preserve the equity of a startup entrepreneur from our community. And that really accelerates what they're able to borrow and what their growth path is. At a certain point, what we're hoping is that they become too large for the resources that we have, and that they'll transition to a business development bank or Meridian credit union. And we've had in the past quite a lot of success working with those institutions and some of our clients as their business size grows. The developmental financing that we undertake, which has those different criteria and different underwriting, may not be as appropriate anymore. And they become a commercial entity with greater capital needs that's better suited for SME lenders like BDC that can help accelerate their growth.
I mean, it sounds like there's a big commitment to removing barriers, which is incredible. So because there's this new commitment, my question is for Isabelle. I'm going to ask you to look into the future. What does the landscape look like in 5 years in respect to SMEs? And will they be led by more people of diverse backgrounds?
So first of all, let me look into my crystal ball that I would love to have. Then I would make a lot of money selling all my advices. But seriously, Jason, when I said that there's about 400,000 entrepreneurs that are saying today that they're not getting the support they need, I also said that 60% and a little bit more than 60% of that amount are entrepreneurs coming from segments of the population that are not well served. When I look at the future, and when you do design a strategy, then it's an action plan, then it's specific goals, because what gets measured usually gets done. We have specific goals for those segments. And I do hope that our growth, and we're doing everything possible to deliver on this ambition, but that a good portion, and 50% of our growth, will be related to helping more of those clients. So it's not just a growth strategy, but it's a dedicated growth strategy to those specific segments. And it is heavy lifting, Jason, to do this. As Jay-Ann said, we need to transform ourselves internally before going out there and sell our products and our services, because we have to look at our own processes. We have to look at our own learnings, our own convictions. We need to accept, to adapt, or to change. And we need to go out there and try new ways of doing things. But in my crystal ball for BDC, I do hope that over the next 10 years, because you don't turn over in less than 10 years, but over the next 10 years, that we will be able to show that our growth, a good portion of our growth, is linked to serving more of those segments of the population that today are not getting the support they need. And why do I bring that level of conviction? I love high ambitions and high aspirations, but also looking back at what BDC has delivered, especially over the last 10 years around women-led companies. You know what? It's more than possible to do it. When you are ready and when you get a certain level of comfort with big goals and understanding that it is difficult, but as a development bank, if we wish to have a capital D to BDC and to play our development role, well, we'll accept this difficult challenge and we will make it happen.
So I love that, because like it sounds ambitious. Part of the ambition to make change, though, is you have to move fast. And I don't view lenders as moving very quickly. So my question for Jay-Ann is, do you think Meridian is moving fast enough?
I am a very impatient person. And so do I think we're moving fast enough? No. Are we on the right trajectory? Are we aligned in the right direction? Yes. I think, we are trying to address that problem that Stephen also talked about in terms of equity. So, we are doing things like investing in some of the Indigenous funds that are out there who are trying to get equity to Indigenous communities. We're doing micro lending through the Afro-Caribbean network for entrepreneurs who need that, like a little bit of money up front. We're partnering with the Rasta community of women who come from the Black diaspora who are who don't trust financial institutions, so they've got their own sort of economy going on. So I think trying to address both once they're bankable and looking at how do we define bankable. And I think because we're smaller, we do have a lot more flexibility there. And I think that's the piece that I think moves fast. And I think that, we can say yes faster and we can also say no faster. And our no is never no permanently. Our no is no, and here's where you can go, right? So we're trying to create that ecosystem around us of partners and like-minded organizations, and making sure that we're playing in all the spaces so you can support that ecosystem that's required for entrepreneurs. So would love us to move faster, but we are moving fast. Like Isabelle at BDC, we have big goals. It's embedded in our balanced scorecard for our organization. We're doubling next year what we did this year. We're on a trajectory to kind of make this the way we do things. And I want to be known as the financial institution that actually makes it happen. I want to do it. And so we're doing it.
It's very interesting, Jason, what Jay-Ann said about saying no faster, but not only saying no. And that's one
right.
thing we do too. It's one thing like to say no, but explaining and showing other options to take for those potential clients. And it's in our role as a development bank also to say, the reasons why we say no today are A, B, C, because often we have good reasons to say no. But if you do 1, 2, 3, you might have better success in few months or a few years to come back, and we could say yes. And 1, 2, 3 can say, well, go get a grant from a different level of governments just to move your business to another level. It could also say, well, maybe before we lend any money, you should get some advisory services on getting a better strategy on paper so that we have better answers from you on what's long and midterm for your business. So it's very important, especially from a Meridian perspective and from our perspective, compared to charter banks when a no is a no. Well, for us, our role is to say no, but we might have some options for you.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Wow. So that actually takes me to my next question for Jay-Ann, and you touched upon it. Like, okay, so I'm an entrepreneur. I got money, I got capital, and I'm so thrilled. But money's not everything. So the question is for Meridian, okay, I need a business bank.
Yeah.
How else do you support entrepreneurs who choose to bank with you?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of things that we do. We connect them with people that we know. We do things like we have just partnered with a marketing consulting firm who's a member of ours. She's doing webinars and videos for free for other members who are looking at how do I actually market. So we try to find those other services that support and help them. And I think the team here has really been of a mindset that, our job is to sit alongside of you, right? So frequent conversations, frequent involvement, making you feel like you have you've got a great big corporation as you're sort of charting down your journey. But, our structure is such that, and our ethos is you become a member of our organization, and your money as a member is helping us do this, right? And so embedded in that is that sort of cooperative spirit. And on the end, we're building out a digital tool set that includes, making sure that the businesses that we're providing financing to have access to the things that they find are important, and some things like commercial insurance and other things, like how do we build those relationships and partnerships. And I think, as Isabelle said at the very beginning, that for organizations our size and others, that's the most important piece is, you know, how do I help Stephen? How does Stephen help me? How do I help Isabelle? How does Isabelle help us? I think that the network effect of that is way more important. And I think entrepreneurs respond to that.
Yeah, I love that. Like
Yeah.
a really great network effect.
Yeah.
As
We just did a small business big impact award process where we had, I think, 2,500 or 3,000 businesses apply, and we're giving them money, right? We're giving them like a $30,000 prize. And so, you know, we want to be able to use that network to demonstrate, you know, for other entrepreneurs, two things. One, how do you grow a successful business, but also how do you grow a successful business that you're also doing something good for people, planet, and community? Because all of these businesses would have a purpose and profit sort of motive. So stay tuned.
So, and this takes me to my last question, which is I'm sure lots of entrepreneurs who are going to be seeing this would love a meeting with each of you. Like, I got to get in a room with the three of you, but there's always that beginning, like just beginning the journey is just, that first step is really long sometimes. So for the people who are going to be watching this, if you can give them one piece of advice when they're starting their journey, what would that piece of advice be to help them maximize their chances for success? Let's start with Jay-Ann.
I'd say I wanted Stephen to start on this one because I think he's closer. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that, you know, the one piece of advice I would give them is probably the advice that they would naturally follow, which is look within your community to see the support that's there, and it is there. I think, you know, developmental lenders like ourselves are an integral part of a Métis business in Ontario starting and expanding. And I think that also in times of crisis, when we look at the recent COVID pandemic, it looked like about 75 to 80% of the Métis businesses in Ontario came to MVDF, to their own community, for equivalents to CEBA and lending support. And it's natural to look within the community. It's a great first place to start. There's supports available, and they're embedded in culture, so that when we do workshops, when we do aftercare and pre-support, that's going to be within the culture, and it's going to be culturally reflective of that entrepreneur's journey, whether they're a First Nations entrepreneur, whether they're Inuit, or whether they're a Métis entrepreneur. And then I think the second part of how we need to support that journey for an entrepreneur is to deepen and really to build those relationships between our communities and the commercial financial sector, and particularly those lenders with a somewhat different mandate, whether that comes from their cooperative ethos or whether that comes from their mandate, as with BDC, building those partnerships so that the entrepreneur first approaches their community, which is where they'll approach. There's a lot of support available, there's a lot of financing available, but also we need to expand that, because if we're looking to that crystal ball that Isabelle was talking about, and we're thinking about economic reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada, you know, 50,000 of those businesses, or maybe 30,000, the stats are not great, are Indigenous businesses. And Indigenous demographics, I mean, Indigenous youth is one of the fastest growing segments in Canada's population. If we're not taking those steps to support those entrepreneurs in this journey, then that problem perpetuates itself into the future. So I think starting with your community, starting with the institutions embedded within it, and letting those institutions build those partnerships, that's incumbent on us to build those partnerships with groups like BDC, like Meridian, to continue that support for that entrepreneur.
What are your thoughts, Isabelle?
So my answer to this is whenever you have a dream, make sure that this dreams become an idea and transform this idea into a plan. So before asking any capital for your big dream, make sure that you transform your big dream into an idea and then a plan. And to do this, you need to network. You need to meet with so many people and speed up your learning curve by asking the right questions and listen, listen, listen. Then when you come to any financial institution, ask the right level of financing, loan, or investment that is aligned to your plan. Little comment for any woman watching: ask more than you think you should get. We see in our data that women will always ask less money than a man would ask. And we also see in our data that women entrepreneurs are way much more better to pay their loan than men. So don't be afraid of talking money and asking for money. If in your head you think that you should ask 50,000, go for 100,000 and maybe you'll get 75,000. Don't be afraid.
That is really good advice.
I love that, Isabelle.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah.
So Jay-Ann, take it home.
Yeah, I think both of those are great. I think, making sure your ideas crystallize is important. I think there's lots of free resources out there. I believe we have, videos and guidebooks and all that kind of stuff on our website, and there's all kinds of. So I would say, to Isabelle's point, ask for, get clear on what you're looking for. I fundamentally believe this. I run an organization whose employees are ready to help. So, look for a branch near you or call our call center and come in. And even if you're in the early stages, at least get some advice, because that's what we're here to do, give financial advice. And so we're all really, really interested in making this a big part of our core business. And so the team's ready to help.
I love like a unifying theme there is asking for help. And I think that's a really great way to end it. So Stephen, Isabelle, Jay-Ann, thank you for joining us today.